Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to return to OP Jindal Global University. I think this is my 5th visit and my 3rd lecture. So I love being here and love meeting the new students and of course the very distinguished faculty. You must be very proud of your professors. So I've been asked by Dr. Kumar to talk about the relationship between peace building and nation building, and this is a subject that's actually very close to my heart. And so it's a great honor and pleasure for me to address this topic. So this is what I'll be talking about this afternoon. What is peace building? What do we mean by that term? And then what's the relationship between the quest for peace in the world and globalization and what President Bush has called the New World Order. Then I'll talk about what is nation building and how do peace building and nation building relate to each other. I'll be talking about the international trading system, first a project of the British Empire, and then that task was handed off in 1945 to the United States. So we'll talk about the relationship between international trade and peace and nation building. I'll also talk about the relationship between the struggle against tyranny, the struggle against ideology, and how the spread of democracy around the world also is contributing to both nation building and peace building. And then I want to talk about a subject very close to my heart, and that is how does the U.S. mission in Afghanistan and Iraq contribute to the quest for international peace. And then I want to say a few words about the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and the role of the relationship between the United States and India in promoting world peace. And then I'll end with a few concluding remarks and then open it up for Q&A. I'm sure many of you will have questions. I look forward to that part of our discussion today. Well, first thing we notice is that the world is a much more peaceful place today than it has ever been. This is something we lose sight of, but if you take a historic point of view, you can see that in the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, there were constant wars between the great powers of the world. But then you can see beginning in the 19th century and continuing into the 20th century, the number of conflicts between the great powers has dropped dramatically. And look, when we get to our century, the 21st century, there are no longer any such conflicts, right? So we had a spike, obviously, in World War I and World War II, but since then, that type of conflict has disappeared. The great powers no longer make war against each other. So the world is definitely a more peaceful place than it has ever been. This graph only looks at the 20th century, and you notice that this is the number of battle deaths, the number of people who died in battle, and there was a spike in the First World War, 1914 to 1918, and of course another spike in the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. But again, look what's happened. Very, very few, almost no battle deaths now. Right? So that's good news, right? Peace has come. Now, how did we get there? What are the foundations for this peaceful world in which we live? Well, a lot of the credit goes to the institutions that came into being as a result of the Second World War. The first one, the United Nations. In 1944, there was a conference in Washington, D.C., the Dumbarton Oaks, and the Foundations for a United Nations, an association of sovereign nations that actually had teeth to enforce international peace, came into being. So this was a great improvement over the League of Nations that came out of the First World War, the United Nations. The second institution was the European Union. That began as the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, and that later led to the United States of Europe, the European Union. The third institution, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that's the association of European nations plus Canada and the United States. Its purpose was to preserve and protect Western Europe against the Soviet Union. It's a product of the Cold War. The next institution is the International Monetary Fund, whose function is to stabilize international finances, and especially the exchange rates among trading countries. And then the World Bank, whose function is to help developing countries grow their economy. Both the World Bank and the IMF came out of the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. And then finally, the World Trade Organization. That emerged out of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that came into being in 1947. And its purpose is to encourage the elimination of tariffs and other trade barriers. Now, the important point is that all of these institutions, which are the foundation of our peaceful world, they were the initiative of the United States. Now, that's the key point. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and his advisors conceived each of these institutions. The second point is that they have all succeeded, and they're all very active organizations today. So there's an institutional foundation to peace, a multilateral, international, institutional foundation. Now let's talk about another change that took place that's very important for peace. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the three great powers that emerged victorious in the war against Germany and Japan were Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Well, basically, Great Britain was broke as a result of the war. And what it meant was there were two superpowers that emerged from that conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union. They were allies in the war against Nazi Germany, but by 1946, they were enemies very quickly. And so George Kennan, in the Department of State, he advocated a policy of containment. And in 1947, President Harry Truman announced the doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, saying whenever freedom is endangered by the Soviet Union or by any other communist power, then the United States will intervene to protect those nations. Now, what happened is, we all know, is that the Cold War, as it was called, ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And only one superpower remained, and that was the United States. So in terms of international relations theory, we call this a unipolar international system, or unipolar international structure. That is, there's only one superpower, the United States. And in 1991, in the Gulf War, where the United States led a coalition to liberate Kuwait against Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, President H.W. Bush announced a new world order, the United States is now the only superpower left. So the tremendous power, the tremendous military might of the United States guarantees world peace. And many analysts compare what they call the Pax Americana to the Pax Romana, which existed under several Roman emperors between the period of Augustus Caesar and the end of the strength of the Roman Empire around 200 AD. So about 200 years, the world was extremely peaceful because of the hegemony of the Roman Empire. Now we can say the world is peaceful because of the hegemony of the United States. Another huge change also occurred in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization. What that meant was China had given up Marxism as an economic system. China had joined the international trading system. China had embraced capitalism as an economic system. So this also meant now we have truly one world. The world was no longer divided between the capitalist world and the communist world. It's all now one world under democratic liberal principles. I myself was involved in this. I was asked by the Chinese government to be an advisor on how China could overcome the objections of the United States to their membership in the WTO based on the fact that they had no legal system. So basically, I was one of the individuals who helped the Chinese government build a legal system. I worked with prosecutors, I worked with judges, I worked with the legal profession, and helping to meet the demands of the United States that China become a nation under the rule of law. So I'm happy to say that we were successful in that project. It's kind of interesting too for me personally. I worked on this project to help China come under the rule of law to develop a legal system. And then later in Afghanistan, I was appointed the senior civilian rule of law advisor to the NATO mission in Afghanistan. And I did that for 5 years. What this table shows you is that the United States spends more on military expenses than all other 7 countries combined. Right? So the U.S. spends $649 billion a year on the military. China, Saudi Arabia, India, France, Russia, they have only a fraction of the investment in defense of the United States. So I already said that President George H.W. Bush announced the New World Order in 1991. And what he means is that China, Russia, the entire world is now part of this single multilateral economic system. And the peace is guaranteed by the military might of the United States. And the New World Order coincides with the acceleration of the process of what we call globalization. So globalization is the interconnectedness of nations and the expansion of international cultural, economic, and political activities. And the integration of the economies of the nations and the free movement of goods and people and capital among different countries, right? So this is one of the most powerful forces in the world today. And globalization presents many opportunities for each one of you. You are attending a global university, and each of you, I'm sure, will have a global career. Now, what's the relationship between peace building and nation building? And again, this is very dear to my heart. This is how I spent a lot of my time over the last 13 years. Okay, basically, it's the main point is this. A multilateral trading system depends upon the ability of a nation to perform certain basic functions. Right? So the nation-state system is the foundation of the international economic system, but each of those nations has to be able to perform basic functions, such as defending its borders, such as enforcing its laws, such as providing basic services to its people, water, electricity, roads, healthcare, right? Unfortunately, not all countries are capable of performing that function. So we have a problem called the problem of weak states. I'll tell you a story. When I first started working in Afghanistan, my projects were funded by the World Bank. So I had many meetings at the World Bank headquarters in Washington. And when I went for my first meeting, I got lost. I didn't know where the room was I was supposed to go to. And the World Bank is a huge complex. So I stopped a secretary and I said, can you tell me where the Afghanistan section is? I have a meeting there. And she said, oh, just go around the corner and look for the sign that says failed states. So then I went to the failed states corridor, and I asked someone there, I said, well, how many failed states are there? And she said, oh, there are two, Iraq and Afghanistan. But why is this a problem? Why are these failed states a problem? They're a problem because look what happens. They are subject to terrorism. They're subject to weapons proliferation, organized crime, infectious diseases. Just think of polio. Where do you find polio? Pakistan, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ebola. Where do you find the worst environmental degradation? And civil conflicts that spill across borders. So these weak states, these failed states, are a problem for the whole world, not just for the people who live in them. So these states cannot effectively participate in the new world order. What you see here is the Brookings Institution Index of State Weaknesses in the Developing World. And the dark red are the weakest states. That's Afghanistan, that's Iraq, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia. They are big problems for all of us. And there's a relationship, obviously, between globalization, remember, cultural, political, economic interconnectedness with other nations. States like Afghanistan, Iraq, DRC, Somalia, they're not very globalized because their institutions are so weak. In Afghanistan, the Taliban right now control half of the territory. So the Afghan government can't even control its own physical territory. Okay, what is the international trading system I've been talking so much about? Well, this really goes back to the British Empire, right? So many people think of in India and the United States, we share that common legacy. We're both products of the British Empire, the British colonial system. But what we don't fully understand, I think, sometimes is that the British Empire is what is called an accidental empire. That, in fact, I sat next to the British ambassador to Afghanistan on a flight from Dubai to Kabul, and she and I talked about this. It was actually the only reason the British government got involved in taking over political control of countries like India was because the British East India Company, which came to this part of the world, South Asia, they came for economic motives, right? They wanted to make money by trading with the people of South Asia. And the same thing with Canada. The British government didn't go to North America to colonize what became Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company. So these two joint stock companies were just trying to make money for merchants. The British government only got involved because these commercial enterprises couldn't do business because of the chaos in these countries and the violence in these places. And so they pleaded with the British government to come send soldiers. Now, to send soldiers across the oceans, you've got to have a navy. So the British Navy was primarily, its purpose was to protect merchant ships and to keep the markets open, to keep the ports open so that the British merchants could engage in commercial activities all over the world. That's why the sun never set on the British Empire. They wanted to trade with the whole world. Now, a very important part of this system is the principle of free trade. And the concept of free trade was a new concept and developed by David Ricardo. And he said that if every country focused on making those products at which it's best and imported everything else from other countries that were making what they did best, then you would have the maximum world wealth, right? So maximum prosperity is possible only if there's freedom of movement of goods around the world, right? So free trade. And the British Liberal Party accepted those principles, and when William Gladstone was Prime Minister in the 19th century, this was the official doctrine of the British government, free trade. So as I mentioned, Britain went broke as a result of the Second World War, and the United States reluctantly took up the mantle of maintaining the international trading system. We talked about, you first see this in 1918 in President Woodrow Wilson's speech called the 14 Points. And this is what he called for the League of Nations, and he advocated free trade in that speech. And then President Franklin Roosevelt picked up the same theme in 1944, 1945, and led to the United Nations and those other institutions we talked about. Now, very closely related to strong states and liberal economic systems is democracy. Countries where the people rule, right? And what we've noticed is that another important trend in the world over the last 70 years has been the triumph of democracy. The end of history, as it's sometimes called. Francis Fukuyama wrote a very excellent book called The End of History. And what he meant by that was fascism no longer appeals to anyone in the world. Marxism no longer appeals really to many people in the world. Islamic fundamentalism has very limited appeal to a very small portion of the world's population. So the democracy, free markets, that is the dominant ideology in the whole world today. Right? Larry Diamond wrote a very interesting, he's a colleague of Francis Fukuyama at Stanford. He wrote a very fascinating book called The Spirit of Democracy, in which he points out that in 1974, nearly 3/4 of all countries were dictatorships. By 2008, more than half were democracies. Myanmar is one of the new democracies, emerging democracies in the world. So there's a positive correlation then between democratic political systems and degree of economic integration. And you see it in this map here. This is called the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index for 2018. And again, the countries that are least democratic are again the ones in the dark red, and those are also failed states and states that do not have functioning political systems or functioning economies. Okay, how do Afghanistan and Iraq fit into this? Well, the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003. And the United States announced its mission in each one of these countries, right? And look at the components of the mission. The United States is trying to build in both Afghanistan and Iraq a strong state, a democratic state, countries with a free market economy integrated into the global investment and trading system, a country that respects civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, countries that observe equality of men and women, and the end of discrimination based on race and ethnicity. So all of my work in both Iraq and Afghanistan, this has been my goal, helping universities perform this function. For example, when I was president of the American University of Afghanistan, my goal was that at least 50% of the students would be women. And I was able to accomplish that. So in the fall 2018 entering class, 51% of the students were women. Now, what about Trump's policy in the Indo-Pacific area? Well, as you know, there's a rivalry between the United States and China. And China is seen as a strategic threat to the United States. For example, it has claims in the South China Sea that conflict with our view of international waters, and also the claims of our allies like Taiwan and South Korea. And of course, now China has announced its Belt and Road Initiative, which is spreading its economic influence around the world. And so both President Obama and President Trump have turned where? To India as the natural ally in this strategic rivalry with China. And I think the alliance between India and the United States is getting stronger day by day by day. Now, there's a fundamental difference between the way China approaches developing countries and the way the United States approaches developing countries. China says, we will give you a big loan so you can build infrastructure. You know, ports, airports, highways, infrastructure, internet infrastructure. We will give you loans to build these things. And we'll send Chinese engineers to design them, Chinese construction companies to build them, right? The U.S. says, no, what we'll do is we'll work with you to make your country attractive to American investors. And so it will be a decision, a business decision, that will be mutually beneficial to both your country and the United States. And that's a much better approach and doesn't result in the huge debts that China is forcing upon countries like Sri Lanka, for example, and Pakistan now. So in conclusion then, we can all say that the world is becoming a more peaceful place. The 21st century is the most peaceful century since the 16th century. The world is becoming more democratic. We saw that. And the world is becoming more prosperous. I think 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in just the last 20 years, many of them here in India. Globalization, obviously, this interconnection between countries supports these broad trends, but we still have a limitation. And the limitation is that some of these countries do not have sufficiently strong states to participate in the new world order, and they cause lots of problems. The spread of terrorism is one of those major problems. So we can conclude then that in the year 2019, if peace is going to be built in places like Asia, then it is necessary to strengthen these weak states. This is a very difficult enterprise. This is what I've been devoting myself to in the last decade, but it's very, very challenging. And I just make one final comment. Some people say, well, we look at President Trump and his, fact that he's imposing tariffs on imports from China, tariffs on aluminum from Europe, and he doesn't seem to be a proponent of free trade or multilateral institutions. My own point of view is that he's really trying to get the best deals for America, but fundamentally he is committed to this post-World War II system that was set up by Franklin Roosevelt. All right, well, you've been a great audience, and thank you.